He had buried his name, his rank, and the 3 years that followed, a mission no government would ever acknowledge. He had learned to fold laundry, pack school lunches, and smile at neighbors who would never know that the quiet man waving from the driveway had once cleared rooms in the dark with nothing but a knife and absolute certainty. Ethan Mercer was 37 years old, and he had almost convinced himself the war was over. Then a dead woman's phone rang in his kitchen, and every carefully constructed version of his ordinary life began to fall apart. Well, if this story already has its hooks in you, good. That means you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like if you want more, and leave a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far these stories travel. Now settle in. This one doesn't let go. The school pickup line moved like it always did. Slow, slightly irritating, full of minivans and coffee cups and parents scrolling their phones with the particular exhaustion of people who had somewhere else to be. Ethan sat in his 6-year-old Civic with the window cracked, listening to the engine tick and watching the crosswalk guard wave kindergartners across the wet asphalt in groups of 3. He looked like nothing. That was the point. Faded gray hoodie. 2-day stubble because he'd forgotten to shave, not because he was cultivating anything. A dent in the passenger door from a parking lot incident he still hadn't gotten around to fixing. The only things in the car worth noting were a child's backpack on the rear seat, pink, decorated with cartoon foxes, and a half-drunk bottle of water that had been rolling around the footwell for probably 2 weeks. He looked like a dad. An ordinary, slightly worn-out dad. Mia came through the school doors at 3:12 with her laces untied on one shoe and paint on her left sleeve, carrying a folded piece of construction paper like it was classified documentation. She spotted the Civic immediately, changed direction without breaking stride, and pulled open the passenger door with the efficiency of a kid who had done this 10,000 times. "I made you something," she announced, climbing in and dropping her backpack on the floor. "I can see that. It's a tiger." Ethan looked at the construction paper she unfolded across the center console. It was orange and had what appeared to be too many legs and a single enormous eye in the center of its face. "That's a great tiger," he said. "Mrs. Patterson said it looked like a crab." "Mrs. Patterson's wrong." Mia buckled her seatbelt with a decisive click and looked out the window as he pulled forward in the line. "She said it in front of everyone." Ethan glanced at her profile. 7 years old, and she had his jaw. Stubborn, set, trying not to show anything. He had always hated seeing his own worst habits reflected back at him in someone so small. "You know what?" he said. "Some people look at a tiger and see a crab. That's their problem, not yours." She considered that for a moment. "Does that mean I can draw her as a crab next time?" "Absolutely not." She grinned, and for the duration of the drive home, 12 minutes through the flat, ordinary grid of Hargrove Falls, Virginia, the world was the size of a Civic with a broken passenger side speaker and a fox backpack and a tiger that looked like a crab. That was enough. That had always been enough. The town of Hargrove Falls was the kind of place that appeared on no one's radar. That was why he'd chosen it. 40,000 residents, a reasonable school district, a hardware store on Main Street that had been operated by the same family for 40 years, and a collective indifference to newcomers that most small towns dressed up as friendliness, but this one simply hadn't bothered to. People left him alone. He left them alone. Nobody asked questions about his past because nobody was particularly interested in his present. He worked 3 days a week doing inventory and light logistics for a regional auto parts distributor. Physical work, repetitive, low stakes. He filled the other days with Mia's schedule, the apartment, and the quiet discipline of a man who had once operated at the absolute edge of human capability and now directed that same discipline toward keeping a 7-year-old fed, educated, and moderately emotionally stable. It wasn't glamorous. It was the best thing he'd ever done. Dinner that evening was pasta with jarred sauce and frozen broccoli because he'd gotten home late and hadn't defrosted the chicken. Mia ate without complaint. She had his appetite, which meant she ate anything put in front of her, while running through a detailed account of a playground dispute involving a disputed handball call and 2 kids named Jalen and Priya. "Who do you think was right?" she asked. "I wasn't there." "But hypothetically." "Hypothetically, handball disputes are impossible to call without video evidence." She stabbed a broccoli floret. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." After dinner, she did 30 minutes of reading on the couch while he cleaned the kitchen, and then bath, teeth. The usual negotiation about whether one more chapter was actually one more chapter or the beginning of an entirely new front in the bedtime war. He won. She fell asleep midway through a sentence about a flying dog, the book still open on her chest, and he sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a moment longer than he needed to, just listening to her breathe. He'd done this every night since she was 4 days old. He suspected he would do it until she was old enough to find it embarrassing. Maybe longer. I was on the couch at 10:15 with a beer he hadn't opened yet when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. Check the unit at Riverside Storage. Bay 14. Don't wait. He stared at the message for a long time. The sender ID was a string of random digits, a burner, obviously. The kind of number that would route through 3 different proxies before tracing back to nothing. He knew because he'd used enough of them. He typed back, wrong number. The reply came in under 30 seconds. Ethan Cole Mercer, Navy SEAL, DevGru, Operation Blackfall. I know who you are. The beer sat on the coffee table, still sealed. He didn't look at it. He hadn't been called Ethan Cole Mercer in 3 years. He'd legally changed his last name to keep the distance. The Cole was his mother's maiden name. The only person who had ever used all 3 names together in the same breath was... He shut that thought down before it could finish forming. He checked on Mia, still asleep. He texted the woman 2 floors up, Mrs. UN, 63 years old, retired librarian, who watched Mia occasionally, and who Mia adored with a ferocity usually reserved for grandmothers and favorite teachers. And she replied within a minute with a thumbs up and go, I'll listen for her. Buang. Riverside Storage was 8 minutes from the apartment, a low flat complex of orange corrugated metal units off Route 9 that catered to people between moves and hoarders who needed distance from their collections. The security lighting was adequate. The parking lot was empty at 10:40 on a Tuesday. Bay 14 had a combination padlock on the roll door. The combination was 3711, the 4-digit code they'd used on a locker in Bahrain 8 years ago, during a 12-day operation he'd spent a decade trying to forget. He knew it before he touched the dial. Some things you never actually forget. They just go quiet. The unit was small, 10 by 12, and nearly empty. A folding table, a laptop, closed, a manila envelope sealed with a strip of packing tape, and on the concrete floor, partially visible beneath the table, a woman's shoe, single, dark blue, the heel broken clean off. Ethan didn't touch anything for a full 30 seconds. He scanned the unit, scanned the corridor behind him, then stepped inside. The envelope had a name written on it in marker, in block letters, Ashford. He'd seen that name once in the last 48 hours. The tech CEO who'd vanished out of her own company headquarters in San Francisco. The story that had made the news cycle for about 16 hours before something louder pushed it sideways. Claire Ashford, 29 or 30 years old, depending on the source, founder of Nexus Systems, which built data infrastructure for government contractors, and half the Fortune 100. Net worth in the range of $2 billion. Disappeared without surveillance footage, without a trace, without even a cleared-out desk, as though the building had simply exhaled her. Ethan hadn't paid the story much attention. Missing billionaires had their own gravitational pull. Someone always found them eventually, or they surfaced on their own with explanations that made sense only to people who moved in circles he'd spent 3 years deliberately leaving. He opened the envelope. Inside, a USB drive, 4 photographs printed on regular paper, and a single index card with 3 lines of text. She found Blackfall. They're using it on civilians now. She's not the only one they'll erase. He looked at the photographs. 3 of them were surveillance stills, grainy, time-stamped, a parking garage, a woman he didn't recognize moving with urgency between concrete columns, clearly aware she was being followed. The 4th photograph was different. It was older, printed on glossy stock, a picture he recognized because he had taken it himself. A field photograph from the 3rd week of Operation Blackfall, 7 people standing in a maintenance corridor somewhere in Eastern Europe, half in tactical gear, all with the flat eyes of people who hadn't slept in 4 days. He was one of the 7. He was standing second from the left. The man at the far right of the photograph, the one with the clean uniform because he'd never gone in with them, who'd been running the operation from above, was a face Ethan hadn't seen since the night he'd signed his separation papers in a room with no windows. his former commanding officer, the man who'd authorized Blackfall, the man who'd let 4 members of Ethan's team die in a foreign facility while he stood at a secure terminal and called it an acceptable operational variance. Commander Douglas Hale, who was, as far as public record was concerned, now the director of a private defense contracting firm worth somewhere in the range of $11 billion. Ethan put everything back in the envelope. He put the envelope in his jacket. He stood in the empty storage unit for a long moment, the fluorescent light buzzing above him, the broken shoe on the floor pointing nowhere. Then he took the laptop under his arm and walked back to his car. Well, he sat in the parking lot for a while without starting the engine. The rational path was simple. Drive home. Delete the text. Leave the envelope in a dumpster 2 miles away, the laptop in another. Whatever Claire Ashford had stumbled into, she had resources, lawyers, security teams. Missing billionaires got found. The FBI had entire divisions. He was a 37-year-old man with a daughter and a part-time warehouse job, and the last time he'd walked toward something like this instead of away from it, he'd come home to a folded flag and a sealed file in the specific silence of a life that had been permanently rearranged. He opened the laptop. Password protected. He tried the Bahrain combination. Incorrect. He tried a second one. The emergency fallback code from Blackfall, the one only the team had known. The screen unlocked. The desktop had one folder. No name on it, just a date, 8 days ago. Inside the folder was a document, 112 pages of technical specifications, internal communications, and financial records, with a 12-page executive summary at the front that someone had written in clear, careful language, like they were trying to make something very complicated legible for someone who might not have much time to read it. The program was called Mirror. It had started as a classified military research project, behavioral conditioning, identity suppression, memory intervention, the kind of thing that sounded theoretical in a congressional hearing and operational in a basement somewhere. It had been mothballed 4 years ago when a Senate oversight panel had asked too many questions, except it hadn't been mothballed. It had been transferred, off the books, off the grid, into the private sector, where a company called Vantris Solutions, a subsidiary of a holding group connected to Nexus Systems, had continued development without oversight, without ethics review, and without the knowledge of Nexus's own CEO. Claire Ashford had found it buried in a routine infrastructure audit. She'd pulled the thread, and then she'd disappeared before she could tell anyone what she'd found. Ethan read for 90 minutes in the parking lot of Riverside Storage, the engine off, the windows beginning to fog with his breath. Mirror wasn't a weapon in any conventional sense. It was a system for eliminating inconvenient people without eliminating them physically. You didn't kill someone when you could simply make them disappear from the record, strip their identity, corrupt their history, replace their documented self with something that couldn't testify, couldn't sue, couldn't be believed. It was the nuclear option for anyone holding information powerful enough to destroy careers, contracts, or programs worth billions of dollars. And according to the document, the system had already been used 12 times in the last 18 months. 12 people who had, from the perspective of every database and record system in the country, simply ceased to exist. He thought about the broken shoe on the floor of Bay 14. He thought about Mia asleep 2 floors above a retired librarian who was listening for her in the dark. He closed the laptop. He sat with his hands on the steering wheel and breathed through his nose the way a combat medic had taught him once, a lifetime ago, in a different kind of parking lot in a different country, when the world had narrowed to a single decision with consequences that would outlast the moment. Then Ethan Mercer started the engine, pulled out of the lot, and drove, not home, not yet, in the direction of a problem he hadn't asked for and couldn't put down. The drive took 40 minutes and led him to a place he hadn't known he was looking for until he was already there. The document on the laptop had included embedded metadata, file paths, access logs, the digital equivalent of fingerprints left on a doorframe by someone moving quickly in the dark. Whoever had compiled it was good, but they'd been working fast and scared people made mistakes they didn't notice until later. One of the access logs had a location tag attached, a timestamp, and a set of coordinates that mapped to an extended stay motel off Interstate 81, 40 miles southwest of Hargrove Falls, in a patch of highway corridor that existed mainly to service truckers and people who needed to stop somewhere that didn't ask too many questions. The Pinecrest Motor Inn had 14 units, an ice machine that sounded like it was in physical pain, and a vacancy sign missing the second letter. Ethan pulled into the lot and cut the headlights before he reached the building. He sat in the dark for a moment, watching the doors. Room 9 had a faint light behind the curtain. Every other room was dark. He walked to the door and knocked twice, paused, knocked once more. A code he invented on the spot because he needed some way to signal that he wasn't someone arriving to finish what someone else had started. 30 seconds of silence. Then a voice through the door. Low, careful. Not panicked, but close to it. "Who sent you?" "Nobody," Ethan said. "I found the storage unit." Another pause. Longer. He heard movement, something being shifted, and then the sound of a security chain being worked before the door opened 2 inches. The woman looking at him through the gap was not what he'd expected, though he wasn't sure exactly what he had expected. Claire Ashford in the photographs he'd found online, the ones from press events and conference stages, had the particular composure of someone who had learned to perform authority as a survival skill in rooms that hadn't originally been designed to include her. The woman in the doorway had that same structural quality to her face, the same sharp intelligence in her eyes. But she'd been running on bad sleep and adrenaline for what looked like the better part of a week, and it showed. Her hair was pulled back with a pen. She was wearing a sweatshirt 2 sizes too large and jeans she'd probably slept in. She looked at him for a long moment without opening the door further. "You're military," she said. "Former." "How former?" 3 years. She studied his face. Whatever she was reading there, he didn't know. He kept still and let her read it. "You found the laptop," she said, "and the envelope, and the shoe." Something shifted in her expression at the mention of the shoe, a brief tightening around the eyes that she controlled quickly. "The shoe was an accident. I twisted my ankle on the way in." She said it like she wanted him to know it wasn't a distress signal, wasn't intentional, wasn't a moment of weakness staged for effect. Just a fact about a broken heel and bad concrete. "How did you know those passwords?" "I was on Blackfall," Ethan said. The door opened all the way. The room smelled like cold coffee and the particular staleness of recycled air that had been breathed too many times. There was a second laptop on the bed, open, connected to a portable router he recognized as a high-end encrypted model, the kind that cost more than his monthly rent. Several printed pages were spread across the bedspread with handwritten notes in the margins. A backpack sat by the bathroom door, half-packed, positioned like she'd been debating whether to run again. She cleared the pages off the single chair so he could sit, then perched on the edge of the bed and looked at him with the expression of someone recalculating everything very quickly. "You read the document," she said. "All 112 pages. Then you know what mirror is." "I know what the document says it is," Ethan said. "Walk me through what you actually found." She didn't argue with the distinction. 8 weeks ago, I commissioned an internal infrastructure audit. Routine. We do it quarterly. I want to know what our systems are touching, what contracts we're adjacent to, what our data architecture is being used for downstream. She paused, turned the coffee cup on the nightstand 90 degrees without drinking from it, a nervous habit she probably didn't know she had. "Nexus doesn't build weapons. We never have. We build the pipes that data moves through, hospitals, city systems, financial networks. I built the company on the principle that infrastructure should be neutral. It either serves people or it doesn't, and you have to be honest about which one it's doing." And the audit found something that wasn't neutral. 3 layers down from our primary architecture, buried in a subcontractor chain that dated back to a government contract we'd inherited when we acquired a smaller firm 4 years ago. Yes. She looked at him steadily. Someone was using our infrastructure as a host framework, not the visible system, the underlying mesh, the part nobody looks at because it's just plumbing. They'd been running Mirror on top of our infrastructure for at least 2 years without our knowledge, using our processing power, our redundancy networks, our security clearances as cover. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "And when you found it?" "I didn't tell anyone inside the company. Not yet. I didn't know how far it went." She said it flatly, without apology, but he heard the weight of it underneath. The specific loneliness of realizing you can't trust the people around you until you know exactly what you're dealing with. "I took the audit data offline. I started tracing the subcontractor chain manually. That's when I found Vantris Solutions. And behind that, the original Mirror project documentation. And behind that, She stopped. Behind that, I found names I recognized, people with access to my company's board. One of them sits on our security oversight committee. Hale, Ethan said. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. You know him. He was my commanding officer on Blackfall. He ran the operation from the command tier. We were the ones who went in. He kept his voice even. It was a thing he'd practiced. 4 people on my team didn't come out. He classified the failure as an environmental incident and had the record sealed within 72 hours. He's been running Vantris for 3 years, Claire said. Defense consulting, officially. Privately, he's been completing what Mercer started as a military project and translating it into a civilian application. Do you understand what that means, a civilian application? It means it's not being used on enemy combatants anymore. It means it's being used on anyone who becomes inconvenient, she said. Journalists, regulators, whistleblowers, people who find the wrong information and make the mistake of telling someone. She reached across the bed and turned one of the printed pages toward him. It was a list of names with dates and status notations. 12 verified cases in 18 months. 3 of them were people who had worked for government oversight agencies. 2 were investigative journalists. 1 was a forensic accountant who'd been hired by an insurance company to audit a defense contract. She looked at him. None of them are dead. That's the part that should scare you. They're just gone. Every record, every credential, every legally documented version of who they were has been corrupted or erased. They exist, but they can't prove it. And without proof of identity, you have nothing. No bank account, no legal standing, no way to come forward, because the moment you try, the system that's supposed to protect you has already been told you don't exist. Ethan looked at the list. He looked at it for a long time. You put together the drive and the envelope, he said. You left it in the storage unit for someone to find. I left it for a specific someone, Claire said. I've been trying to reach people I thought I could trust for 6 days. 2 of them stopped returning contact. One told me I was mistaken and then went silent. I needed someone who had direct knowledge of Blackfall and who wasn't inside any system Hale could reach. She paused. Your name came up in the original Mercer files. They'd flagged you as a potential risk, someone who knew enough about the program's origins to cause problems if he ever decided to start talking. I found your relocation. The name change wasn't as complete as you thought. He absorbed that without showing much. It wasn't entirely a surprise. You could build a good quiet life, but if someone with real resources decided to look, they could usually find the seams. So you picked me, he said. I needed someone who understood what they were looking at. She said it without sentimentality, just the blunt logic of a person who had been running out of options and made the best one she had. And you came. I came to see what was in the unit. I haven't agreed to anything. She nodded. She seemed to have expected that. Then let me show you the rest. The rest took 2 hours. She walked him through everything she'd compiled with the methodical precision of someone who had been building this case in isolation, layer by layer, knowing that every piece had to be airtight, because once she moved on it, there would be no second attempt. She wasn't a lawyer and she wasn't an investigator, but she had built a billion-dollar company from a rented server room and a legal pad, and she had the same organizational intelligence applied here that she'd applied to everything else, focused, thorough, and ruthlessly aware of what she didn't yet know. The financial architecture connecting Vantris Solutions to Hale's network was complex, but she'd mapped it in clear charts. The Mercer technical specifications indicated a system that still required a central server infrastructure to function. It wasn't distributed yet, which meant there was a physical location where the core architecture lived. If that location could be identified and the system shut down at the source, every active Mercer case would begin to unravel. The corrupted identities weren't permanently destroyed. They were maintained by the system in real time. Kill the system, and the records it had suppressed would begin to resurface through natural redundancy in linked databases. There's a facility, Claire said, pulling up a satellite image on the second laptop. In western Pennsylvania. Industrial park, mostly empty, registered to a logistics holding company that traces back through 4 shell entities to a Vantris subsidiary. The building was retrofitted 8 months ago. The permits describe it as a data processing upgrade, but the power draw is 3 times what any logistics operation would need. I found the power consumption data through a public utility filing. She pointed at the image. That's where it is. That's where the servers are. Getting into that facility without dying first requires more than 2 people and a laptop, Ethan said. I know. And walking into any federal agency with this creates an immediate problem if Hale has contacts positioned at the access points. I know that too. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to storm a building. I need someone who can get me to the facility in one piece. Keep me alive long enough to complete a remote upload that will permanently corrupt Mirror's core architecture and help me get the documentation into the right hands at the federal level. People Hale can't reach. She paused. There are people at the FBI's cyber division who aren't in his network. I have 2 names. I just need to stay alive long enough to reach them. You said you've been out here 6 days, Ethan said. If Hale's people flagged you as a risk, they've been looking for you the whole time. Yes. Which means they've been getting closer. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. He stood up and walked to the window and looked at the parking lot through the gap in the curtains. The lot was still empty. The ice machine made its grinding complaint into the dark. I have a daughter, he said. She's 7. She's asleep right now in our apartment with a neighbor watching her. Claire was quiet. I'm telling you that because you should understand what I'm putting on the table if I walk further into this than I already have. He turned away from the window. I'm not a SEAL anymore. I'm a dad who does warehouse inventory 3 days a week and forgets to shave. Whatever I was before, that's not who I am right now. I understand, Claire said. I don't think you do, actually. I think you understand it as information. I'm not sure you understand it as a reason to walk away. He studied her face. You're not going to stop, are you? Even if I say no. She held his gaze without flinching. No, I'm not. He rubbed the back of his neck, looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man who already knows what he's going to do and is taking the last few seconds to be honest with himself about it. What's your plan for getting to Pennsylvania? They left at 4 a.m. in her car, a rented sedan registered to a name that wasn't hers, paid in cash through a layered arrangement she'd set up on day 2 of her disappearance. She drove. Ethan rode with the second laptop open on his knees, working through the facility documentation and cross-referencing the satellite images with topographic data he pulled from public mapping sources. He'd called Mrs. Yuan at 3:30 from a borrowed phone. The older woman had answered on the second ring, wide awake in the way of people who had learned not to sleep heavily. He'd told her there was a family situation, that he needed her to stay with Mia through the morning, that he'd explain when he got back. She'd asked 2 questions. Was Mia in any danger, and did he need anything? He'd said no to the first and nothing to the second, and she'd said go in the same tone she'd used for 30 years with students who needed permission to do the right difficult thing. He didn't call Mia. He'd thought about it, then decided against it. She'd be asleep. Waking her to say goodbye to something she didn't know was happening would only frighten her without giving either of them anything useful. He pushed that decision to the back of his mind and kept it there. The first 2 hours of driving were quiet. Interstate 81 at 4 a.m. was empty enough that you could see other headlights from a mile out. Ethan watched them. Every set of lights. Claire noticed and didn't comment, which he appreciated. She understood surveillance without needing to perform anxiety about it. Just past the West Virginia state line, she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "The mission. Blackfall. What actually happened?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a dark stretch of highway rolled past. No features, just the white paint of the center line coming and going in the headlights. "We were sent to retrieve documentation from a facility that was allegedly storing unauthorized bioweapon research material," he said. 6-person team. I was senior operator. We were told the facility would be lightly guarded, skeleton crew, low risk. But it wasn't. The intelligence was wrong, or it had been deliberately compromised. I still don't know which. And I stopped trying to find out because the answer didn't change anything for the 4 people we left in that building. He said it evenly, with the particular flatness of something that had been turned over so many times it had worn smooth. We completed the objective. We got the documentation. We lost 4 operators doing it. When we came out, Hale was waiting at the extraction point, and the first thing he said wasn't anything about the team. It was asking whether the primary drive was intact. Claire said nothing. After the debrief, I filed a report stating that the mission parameters had been materially misrepresented and that the intelligence failure warranted a full investigation. Hale buried the report. 3 months later, I was given the option to sign a non-disclosure agreement with a generous separation package attached, or face a conduct review on charges that didn't exist. He glanced at the side mirror. Nothing behind them. I signed. I took Mia, and I left. He paused. I've thought about what I should have done instead about every other day for 3 years. You had a 4-year-old, Claire said. That's what I tell myself. She was quiet for a moment. I think it's true. Maybe. He looked out at the dark highway. Doesn't make the other 4 less dead. They stopped once, outside a town called Mineral Creek, at a gas station that doubled as a convenience store. Ethan went in and bought coffee and a road atlas, paper, because he'd started to distrust the GPS, and Claire agreed, and 2 protein bars that tasted like sweetened concrete but provided calories, which was the only quality he was shopping for at 5:30 in the morning. He was back at the car in 4 minutes. Claire had moved to the passenger seat. She looked like she'd been fighting sleep and losing. I can drive, he said. I know. She didn't argue the point. He pulled back onto the highway. She drank her coffee in silence for a few miles, then said, The board member who's connected to Hale. His name is Preston Vance. He's been on the Nexus board for 18 months. He came in through a strategic investment that I approved because the terms were good and his background checked out. She said it with a specific bitterness that wasn't quite self-directed but adjacent to it. I did the due diligence myself. I didn't find anything because whatever they'd built on him was clean enough to survive a standard check, which means they'd been planning the Nexus infiltration before the investment happened, probably before I even incorporated. They built toward you, Ethan said. They built around me, she corrected. I was running a company that was becoming the most important infrastructure network in the private sector, and I had no idea that the foundation I was building on had already been claimed. She looked out the passenger window. The sky to the east had begun to thin from black to dark blue. Barely perceptible, but there. I built company to do something real, to make something that people could actually depend on, and they turned it into a weapon without ever asking me. That's not your fault. I know it's not my fault, she said, sharper than she probably meant. Then quieter. It's still mine to fix. He understood that. He understood it in the particular way of someone who had spent 3 years trying to live with the inverse, walking away from something that was his to fix and telling himself it was the only rational choice. He didn't say any of that. Some things didn't benefit from being said out loud. By 7 a.m. they were in Pennsylvania, and by 9 a.m. they were parked in the lot of a diner outside a town called Fenwick Station, 12 miles from the coordinates in Claire's satellite image. The diner had 7 tables and a hand-lettered sign advertising the breakfast special, and a woman behind the counter who refilled coffee without being asked and didn't look at them twice. They ate. Eggs, toast, hash browns, actual food, the kind that didn't come in a foil wrapper. Ethan ate methodically and watched the parking lot through the window. 2 trucks, a minivan, a county vehicle of some kind. Nothing that looked out of place. There are 2 entrances to the facility based on the satellite image, Claire said, keeping her voice below the ambient noise of the diner. She had the road atlas open on the table between them, marked with pencil. The main gate on the east side faces the access road. There's a secondary access point on the north side that runs along the utility corridor, less visible from the road. What's your upload process? Ethan asked. I need physical access to the facility's internal network, not the internet-facing side, the operations layer. Mirror runs on an isolated internal system for security reasons, which means I need to get inside, find a terminal, and execute the upload manually. She tapped the pencil against the table once. I built the corruption protocol myself over the last 2 weeks. It's designed to propagate through the system architecture and make the core programming unrecoverable. Once it runs, it can't be stopped mid-process. The whole system crashes within approximately 4 minutes of initiation. 4 minutes is a long time inside a secure facility. Yes, she agreed. It is. He looked at the map, looked at her. She met his gaze with the particular steadiness of someone who had already calculated the odds and decided to move anyway. And he thought about how much easier it would have been if she'd been less clear-eyed about it, if she'd been naive or reckless, or operating on pure adrenaline rather than cold, deliberate awareness of exactly what she was walking into. It would have been easier to walk away from recklessness. This was harder to argue with. His phone, the borrowed one, buzzed once. A text from Mrs. Ewan. Mia up, eating breakfast, told her you had an early work thing. She says, tell you she wants pancakes when you get home. He read it twice. Set the phone face down on the table. Okay, he said. Show me the entry points again. They did the reconnaissance pass at midday, driving the access road twice at normal speed, the way anyone would drive if they knew where they were going and weren't in any particular hurry. The facility was a long, low building, industrial gray, with a chain-link perimeter and what looked like two security posts, one at the main gate, one on the north side. The windows were blacked out. The parking area on the east side had 4 vehicles in it. Professional, clean. On the second pass, Ethan spotted the cameras, 6 visible, positioned to cover the perimeter with overlapping fields. He also spotted the one angle they didn't cover well, a 15-foot section of the north fence, where the utility corridor brought a maintenance access line close enough to the building that the camera above it would have its sight line partially blocked by the infrastructure hardware. That's how we go in, he said. Tonight? Tonight, after midnight. Less personnel, lower attention. He looked at the building as they passed. Once we're inside, we move fast. You find the terminal, you run the upload, and we don't stop for anything until we're out. And the outer security teams? He thought about that for a moment. I'll handle them. She looked at him. How? Not lethally if I can avoid it. Most of those guys are private security. They're doing a job. They probably don't know half of what they're protecting. He paused. But if it comes to it, I know, Claire said. She said it without flinching, which he noted. Just get me to the terminal. They drove back to Fenwick Station and found a motel above a hardware store. Separate rooms. Ethan sat on the edge of his bed in the afternoon light and checked the room for anything useful. He'd bought a few basic items at a hardware store in the last town, the kind of unremarkable purchases that added up to something only in combination. His hands moved through a quick inventory with a muscle memory he hadn't asked to retain and that had apparently retained itself without his permission. He sat with his back against the headboard and thought about Mia and pancakes. And he thought about 4 people in a building in Eastern Europe. And he thought about 12 names on a printed list, people who were alive but who had been erased from the architecture of their own existence. And he thought about a woman 2 rooms over who had built something real and had it turned against her and was still fighting to fix it with the specific stubbornness of someone who understood that walking away would mean living with a different kind of damage. He set an alarm for 11 p.m. and closed his eyes. And because he was a former Navy SEAL and old habits didn't die, they just went quiet. He was asleep in under 4 minutes. Outside, the afternoon moved toward evening, the Pennsylvania hills going amber and then dark. And somewhere in a building 12 miles away, a system called Mirror ran its quiet processes against the documented lives of people who didn't yet know they were being erased. The alarm pulled him out of sleep at 11 p.m., and he was sitting upright before the second buzz, the way he'd woken up every morning for 6 years in the teams. Not gradually, not with the slow assembly of consciousness that most people required, but all at once, completely present, like a switch thrown in a dark room. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment and listened to the motel. The hardware store below was long closed. The street outside was quiet. A dog was barking somewhere 2 blocks over, steady and disinterested, just marking the night. He dressed in the dark. Dark pants, dark long sleeve, the jacket he'd worn in. He checked the items he'd laid out on the nightstand. Zip ties, a folding utility blade, a small LED flashlight, the USB drive Claire had preloaded with the corruption protocol, a burner phone with her number already saved. Basic. Nothing that would have impressed anyone from his old life. But you worked with what you had, and what you had was what the situation gave you. He knocked on Claire's door at 11:20. She answered in under 10 seconds, which meant she hadn't slept either. You should have slept, he said. I know. She stepped out, backpack over one shoulder, the second laptop in a padded sleeve under her arm. She'd changed into dark clothing, and whoever she'd been when she stood on stages accepting industry awards had been packed away somewhere beneath this version of herself, tighter, quieter, operating on a frequency he recognized from people who had learned to function under pressure that had no clean end date. They drove without speaking for the first 10 minutes. The Pennsylvania back roads at midnight had their own specific quality. Not silent exactly, but emptied, the kind of dark that exists between towns where there are no streetlights, and the trees on both sides of the road close in just enough to make the headlights feel insufficient. You nervous? he asked. Yes, she said immediately. No hesitation, no performance of calm. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. Good. People who aren't nervous make bad decisions in there. Is that something they taught you? No. That's something I figured out after the third time I watched someone who wasn't nervous enough get themselves killed. He said it without drama. It was just true. Being nervous means you're paying attention to what it actually costs if things go wrong. That's useful. Just don't let it make you freeze. I don't freeze, she said. I know. You've been running for 6 days and you're still moving forward. That tells me enough. She looked out the passenger window. I keep thinking about the 12 people on that list, she said. Not in an abstract way. I've been thinking about each of them specifically. There was a woman named Sandra Reeves. She was a financial regulator, 43 years old. She had 2 kids in middle school. According to the Mirror file, they erased her 16 months ago. She's been living in a shelter in Ohio because she can't access her own bank accounts, can't prove her professional credentials, can't get any legal recognition that she exists. Her kids were told she abandoned them. She stopped. I keep thinking about those kids. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. Then think about them when it gets hard in there. That's what they're for. He parked the car on a service road a quarter-mile from the facility's north perimeter, tucked behind a stand of trees far enough from the road that it wouldn't draw a passing patrol's attention. They walked the rest on foot, moving through a narrow corridor of scrub brush that ran parallel to the utility infrastructure along the facility's north wall. The night was cool, a light wind from the northwest that covered the sound of their movement. A useful accident. Ethan moved at a pace Claire could match without forcing it. She was quieter on her feet than he'd expected, controlled, not overcorrecting the way people did when they were concentrating too hard on being silent. The camera blind spot was exactly where he'd clocked it on the reconnaissance pass. The utility conduit housing created a shadow approximately 4 feet wide along the fence line at this angle, and the camera mounted above it was fixed, not panning, pointed 10 degrees too far south to compensate for the infrastructure obstruction. Someone had set the camera positioning in daylight and hadn't accounted for the geometry correctly. It was the kind of small, compounding error that you only found by looking for them, and most people didn't look. He went over the fence first, moving quickly and without sound on the chain link, dropping to the inside in a controlled descent. Claire followed. She caught her jacket on the top link and lost 2 seconds working it free, but she didn't panic about it, just worked the problem with both hands until it came loose, and dropped down beside him in the shadow of the conduit housing. He held up a closed fist. She went still. They waited 30 seconds. Nothing moved on their side of the fence. The north face of the building was 40 meters ahead, a solid gray wall with a single door. The maintenance access point they'd identified from the blueprint data Claire had pulled from the utility filing records. The door would be locked. He dealt with that contingency during the equipment review at the hardware store. They crossed the 40 meters in a low, direct line, not running, not crawling, just moving with purpose and without hesitation, because people who moved like they belonged somewhere were harder to clock at a distance than people who moved like they were afraid. He'd learned that long before he was a SEAL. He'd learned it from his uncle, who'd grown up in a part of Savannah where how you moved through space was its own kind of credential. The maintenance door had a keypad lock and a secondary deadbolt. He worked the deadbolt with the tension wrench and pick he'd fashioned from a hardware store purchase that the receipt would describe as a locksmith's practice kit, which was exactly what it was. 22 seconds. The keypad was trickier. Keypads required either the code or a bypass, and he didn't have the code. He'd found a vulnerability in this specific model during a 10-minute search on Claire's laptop in the motel room, a known flaw in a firmware version that hadn't been patched in installations prior to 2021. He pulled a small device from his jacket pocket, a modified reader Claire had assembled from components she'd ordered to a drop address 2 weeks ago and retrieved from a dead drop she'd set up before going dark. It took 40 seconds, and the door opened. The interior was dim, running on reduced night lighting, a blue-white LED strip along the ceiling every 20 feet. Enough to navigate by. The maintenance corridor ran the length of the building's north side before opening into the operational interior. They moved through it single file, Ethan ahead, listening as much as looking. Operations level is below us, Claire whispered behind him. The server infrastructure is subterranean. The power consumption data confirmed it. There should be a stairwell at the end of this corridor. I saw it on the layout. How many terminals will have operations access? At minimum, any workstation in the server management room. I'll know it when I see it. Mirror's interface has a specific architecture I've been studying for 2 weeks. The corridor ended at a T-junction. Left was a utility room. Right was a door marked with a standard maintenance designation that corresponded to nothing in the official filing paperwork. The stairwell was through that door. He pushed it open carefully and held it, scanning the stairwell below. Concrete steps, no carpet, a handrail that had been installed practically rather than aesthetically. The sound of active server cooling reached them from below. A constant low mechanical breath, like the building itself was alive and working hard. They went down. The lower level opened into a server room larger than Ethan had estimated from the surface. Rows of black server towers, status lights blinking in various colors, cooling units running along the walls, the ambient noise enough to mask footsteps. At the far end of the room, past the server rows, a glass-walled office space contained 4 workstations. "That's it," Claire said. They were halfway across the server room when Ethan heard it. A footstep above the server noise, too irregular to be mechanical, coming from the right side of the room where a secondary door had been invisible on any layout he'd seen. He caught Claire's arm and pulled her behind the nearest server row in one motion, pressing them both flat against the housing. 3 seconds later, a security guard walked the cross aisle 10 feet from where they'd been standing, flashlight angled down at the floor in the bored manner of someone doing a routine check at 1 a.m. who expected to find nothing. The guard was male, mid-30s, built solidly, with the careful movement of someone who'd had actual training at some point. Ethan watched him through the gap between server housings. The guard made the cross aisle, checked a panel on the wall, made a note on a handheld device, and kept walking toward the far door. Ethan stayed still until the far door opened and closed. "Go," he said quietly. Claire moved to the glass-walled office and sat at the nearest workstation. Her hands on the keyboard were immediate and certain. She didn't waste time orienting herself, just worked through the login sequence from what she'd memorized of Mirror's access architecture, her eyes moving fast across the screen. Ethan positioned himself at the entry point, watching both the door they'd come through and the cross aisle where the guard had appeared. "How long?" he said, low. "I need to find the operations layer and confirm I'm in the right partition before I run the upload. 7 minutes, maybe less." 7 minutes. He ran a quick inventory of what he actually had available to him and came to the usual conclusion that it was less than ideal and more than nothing. The far door opened again 2 minutes later. The guard had come back with a second man, older, heavier, carrying a radio rather than a flashlight. Ethan didn't wait for them to reach the cross aisle. He moved along the server row in the direction that cut the angle, came around the end of the row closest to the 2 men, and covered the distance between them in the time it took the older man to bring his radio halfway to his mouth. What followed was not clean. He'd long ago stopped pretending that any of this was clean. The younger guard was fast and got an elbow into Ethan's ribs before Ethan had finished the control hold, and the pain was bright and immediate, and he filed it away without responding to it. He got the guard down without permanent damage. Pressure hold, specific, something that would put a man out for 10 minutes and leave him with a headache and a story. The older man with the radio got the radio to his mouth and said 2 words before Ethan closed the distance, and whether a transmission went out or not he didn't know but had to assume yes. He zip-tied both men to a server housing bracket, checked their pulses out of habit, then went back to the glass office. "Someone may have called it in," he said. Claire didn't look up from the screen. "I found the partition, running the upload now." "How long?" 4 minutes from initiation. She hit a key. On the screen, a progress bar appeared, white against black, beginning its slow fill. "Starting now." 4 minutes. He went back to the door they'd entered from and held it, listening to the stairwell. Nothing yet. He moved to the far door that the guards had come from and listened there too. Nothing immediate, but he could hear something deeper in the building, a door somewhere above, footsteps on a hard surface. The transmission had gotten through. He went back to the server room floor and started thinking about geometry. 1 entry from the stairwell, 1 entry from the guard's access point. Both were potential problems. He was one person. The server rows were cover, but they were also a maze. Advantage if he used it correctly, liability if he let someone drive him into a corner. He pulled a server housing panel off the nearest unit and positioned it as a redirect at the cross aisle. Not a barrier, just an angle that would break someone's sightline for 1 second. 1 second was often the difference between getting hit and not getting hit. He wasn't proud of how much of his usable knowledge came down to variations on that principle. The stairwell door opened at the 2-minute mark. 2 men in tactical gear, moving professionally, flashlights up and weapons ready. Not local security, not the building guards. These were the kind of people Hale kept available for exactly this kind of situation. Private contractors with enough training to move right, but not enough history to have judgment about when to stop. They stacked at the stairwell door and came through fast. Ethan was not where they were looking. He was in the cross aisle to their left, having moved there in the seconds before the door opened because he'd heard the stack forming on the other side. He let them pass his position before he moved. He took the rear operator first, which was the correct choice tactically, and the one he would have made 10 years ago without thinking, and he still made it without thinking now, which told him something he wasn't entirely comfortable with about how much of this was still inside him, regardless of 3 years of grocery runs and school pickups. The rear operator went down hard on the concrete floor. The forward operator spun, flashlight sweeping, and Ethan was already moving laterally behind the server row before the light found him. The operator came after him into the row, which was the mistake Ethan had been waiting for. Tight quarters favored someone who was willing to get close and remove the utility of a firearm. The operator wasn't ready for how fast Ethan closed that distance. He wasn't fast the way he'd been at 28. He felt it. The half-second difference, the way his knee protested the drop to the floor, the rib where the first guard had landed the elbow. His body was keeping a running account of the evening's transactions. But he was still faster than the calculation the operator had made when he followed him into the row. The second man was down. Ethan stood up, breathing through his mouth, and walked back to the glass office. 2 minutes, Claire said without looking up. The progress bar was past the halfway point. I'm seeing the system trying to run a counter protocol. It detected the upload. Can it stop it? No, once this starts, it's locked in. But it's logging the intrusion, and I think it's sending an alert to... She stopped. To who? She turned and looked at him, and the expression on her face was the first one he'd seen on her that had something in it that wasn't quite controlled. To the facility director, whoever monitors Mirror at the administrative level. Someone just got a notification that the core system is under attack. Hale, Ethan said. He might not be here physically. He might be. The far door, the guard's access point, opened, and this time 4 men came through it. And these were not building security and were not the private contractor pair from the stairwell. These were something more deliberate, moving with the specific economy of people who had done this kind of work for a long time and had no particular feelings about it. Ethan put the server housing panel between himself and their sightline and ran the math. 4 trained men, one of him, 2 minutes on the clock, and Claire at a terminal she couldn't leave. He thought very briefly and with complete clarity that this was going to be a problem. Then he started moving. He went toward them instead of away, which was the only option that didn't end with him cornered. He hit the cross aisle going full speed and cut right into the gap between the second and third server rows before they'd fully processed where he was. The tactic was simple and ugly. Make them deal with geometry instead of superior numbers. Keep moving. Don't let 4 people get a simultaneous line on the same target. The first man he reached got a forearm to the throat that dropped him sideways into a server housing with a crash that was loud enough to be felt through the floor. The second got a knee, then a control throw that used the man's own momentum against him. Ethan's hands on his jacket, a pivot, and the man went into the concrete with his own weight driving the impact. It wasn't graceful. It looked like what it was, which was someone doing controlled violence as efficiently as possible under bad conditions. 3 and 4 had split to come around both ends of the row, which was the right tactic. Ethan went straight through the end of the row before either flanker arrived, which bought him 2 seconds and cost him a collision with a cooling unit that scraped his forearm open against the metal casing. He registered it the way you registered weather, as a condition, not a crisis. He was down to managing delay rather than clean resolution. He needed 90 more seconds and enough space between him and 4 determined men to prevent Claire from being grabbed before the upload completed. He got it by not fighting the last 2 men directly. He looped back through the server rows, drawing them after him, using the maze of the room the way the terrain had always been his to use or ignore. He gave them his position in flashes, a sound, a visible movement at the end of a row, and then relocated before they could converge. It was exhausting and imprecise, and his ribs were making themselves loudly known, and the scrape on his forearm was doing something warm and uncomfortable inside his sleeve, but he kept moving. 30 seconds, Claire called from the office. Her voice was steady. He didn't know how she managed it. He was at the far end of the server room when the door behind the glass office opened. Not the stairwell door, not the guard's access point, but a third door he hadn't known existed, recessed in the back wall of the office space itself. The kind of door that didn't appear on any layout because it had been built specifically for someone who wanted a way in and out that nobody else knew about. The man who came through it was not security. He was dressed in a dark suit that hadn't come from any regular retailer, carrying nothing visible, moving with the particular ease of someone who owned every room he walked into and had made a practice of it for decades. Douglas Hale was 61 years old and looked like a person for whom age had been less an erosion than a refinement. The same jaw, the same steady gray eyes, the same quality of complete self-possession that had made him effective at running operations where other people carried the actual risk. He'd gained some weight in the years since Ethan had last seen him, but it sat on him like ballast rather than deterioration. He looked across the server room floor at Ethan. Then he looked through the glass wall at Claire, who was watching the progress bar complete its final 10%. Ethan, he said. He said it the way you said the name of someone you'd been expecting. Ethan was breathing hard. The two men behind him had stopped moving when Hale appeared, which told him that the chain of command here was direct and unambiguous. He put himself between Hale and the glass office and didn't say anything. You should have signed the agreement and stayed in Virginia, Hale said. He sounded less angry than genuinely disappointed, which was somehow worse. This didn't have to involve you. She found something she shouldn't have found. We were managing it. And in another week it would have been resolved quietly, and you'd still be driving your daughter to school, and none of this. Managing it, Ethan said. Like you managed the 12 people on her list. Like you managed Blackfall. Hale's expression shifted by a degree. Something tightened in it, and then was controlled. Blackfall was a necessary operation that had a difficult outcome. Difficult outcomes happen. You knew that going in. I knew 4 people going in. I knew what you told us about the parameters. I know what the reality was when we got there. The intelligence was imperfect. That happens in this work. The intelligence was deliberately wrong, Ethan said. You sent us in blind because you needed the operation to look contested enough to justify the program's continuation funding. You needed enough operational friction to generate a convincing after-action report. He said it straight and flat. He'd thought about this for 3 years, and the conclusion had gotten cleaner over time, not less certain. 4 people died so you could keep Mirror funded for another fiscal year. The room was very quiet except for the server cooling. Hale looked at him for a long moment. That's an extraordinary accusation. I know. You can't prove any of it. She can, Ethan said. Behind the glass, the progress bar completed. Claire's hands left the keyboard. She looked up, first at the screen, then through the glass at Ethan, and the expression on her face was not relief exactly. It was the specific blankness of someone who has just done something that cannot be undone and is feeling the full weight of that irreversibility land all at once. The facility's server room filled with a sound they hadn't heard before. A deceleration, subtle and systemic, like a great machine beginning to power down from the inside. Status lights across the server rows began shifting from their normal cycling colors to flat amber and then dark, row by row, moving through the room like a wave. Mirror was dying. Hale looked at the server rows. Then he looked at Ethan, and the expression on his face in that moment was not fury and not desperation. It was a cold, precise recalculation. The expression of a man who had spent 40 years operating in situations that required constant adaptation and who had not yet decided this one was beyond recovery. You think this ends it, Haley said quietly. The upload is irreversible, Ethan said. You can't stop it. No. Hale glanced at the darkening server rows. But I can still manage what comes next. I have resources you can't account for. I have people in places you haven't thought to look. He took a single step forward. And I have a file on you, Ethan, not just the NDA, a complete file. Your daughter's school, the neighbor who watches her, the storage unit, every step of the last 3 years. I had it prepared when you went quiet. in case you ever decided to become a problem. He said it not as a threat, but as information. The dispassionate delivery of someone who believed information was the only currency that mattered. Sign what I put in front of you tonight, give me the remaining documentation she compiled, and I make the file disappear. You go home. Your daughter's life stays exactly as it is. Ethan heard it. He let it land fully. Let himself feel the actual weight of it, because denying the weight of it would have been dishonest, and he'd run out of tolerance for dishonesty about what mattered to him. He thought about Mia. Not abstractly. Specifically, the fox backpack, the tiger that looked like a crab, the way she said his name when she was mostly asleep and heard him check on her, just a reflexive murmur, Dad, as though even in sleep she wanted to confirm he was still there. He stood with that for a full 3 seconds. Then he said, No. Hale's expression didn't change. You understand what you're choosing. I understand what you're threatening, Ethan said. And I understand that every person whose life your program destroyed made the same calculation you're asking me to make right now. They weighed the cost to themselves against the cost to everyone else, and they made whatever choice they made. Some of them chose to stay quiet. He looked at Hale steadily. I'm not going to. From somewhere above them, above the building, external, growing louder, came the sound of rotors. Multiple sets, the heavy beat of something official and large. And beneath that, from the direction of the facility's main entrance, the sound of vehicles, fast, with the specific engine note of federal fleet vehicles that were not trying to be quiet about their arrival. Hale heard it. For the first time in the conversation, something moved behind his eyes that wasn't calculation. Claire had come out of the glass office and was standing beside Ethan, the laptop under her arm, watching Hale with an expression that was still quiet, but had something underneath it now. Not victory, nothing that neat, but the particular composure of someone who has been running towards something for a long time and has finally arrived. The documentation went out, she said to Hale. All of it. Every financial record, every classified file, every name. I had a dead man protocol set up. If the upload completed, everything we compiled went simultaneously to 6 recipients. 3 federal agencies, 2 investigative journalists, and a law firm that specializes in government accountability cases. She paused. I set that up before I left San Francisco. I just needed to complete the upload to confirm the authenticity of the core files. The rotors were directly overhead. Douglas Hale looked at the two of them. The 37-year-old man with a scrape on his forearm and 3 years of careful, quiet life behind him, and the 30-year-old woman who had spent 6 days running from people paid to erase her. And for the first time in the conversation, he had nothing to say that was going to change the geometry of what had already been set in motion. The building's overhead lights came on at full intensity as power was redirected from the dying server infrastructure. In the flat white light, the server room looked suddenly ordinary. Just hardware going dark. Just a room. Just the remnant of a system that had been quietly running its processes against people's lives and would not run them anymore. Ethan's ribs hurt. His forearm was a problem he was going to have to deal with soon. He was 37 years old and had spent 3 years becoming someone's father full-time, and none of him felt legendary or cinematic or like anything except a very tired man standing on a concrete floor waiting for the next thing to happen. But the program was dead, and the doors were coming open, and that was enough for right now. The federal agents came through 3 entry points simultaneously: the main gate, the north maintenance access, and a side door on the east wall that the facility's own security team hadn't known existed until the breach team cut through it in under 40 seconds. They moved with the particular coordinated efficiency of people who had rehearsed this specific type of entry enough times that it had become procedural rather than tense. And within 4 minutes of the first door coming open, the facility's ground level was secured, its remaining personnel were on their knees with their hands behind their heads, and the underground server room had been reached by a 6-person cyber forensics who immediately began documenting the hardware state with the focused attention of people who understood that dying servers still told stories if you reached them quickly enough. Ethan and Claire were separated at the stairwell. Not roughly. The agents who reached them were professional, and the lead agent, a woman in her 40s named Reyes, who moved like she'd seen everything and was perpetually mildly irritated by most of it, recognized Claire immediately and acknowledged Ethan with the specific look of someone who had been briefed on a situation and was now reconciling the briefing with the reality standing in front of her. "You look worse than the file photo," she said to Ethan. I've had a busy night. We'll need your weapons. I don't have any weapons. She looked at the zip ties on the two security guards still attached to the server housing bracket. She looked at the four tactical contractors on the floor in various states of consciousness. She looked at the scrape on his forearm and the way he was holding his left side where the rib had taken the elbow. Right, she said, and moved on. They kept him in the stairwell corridor while a paramedic, young, efficient, working from a field kit, cleaned and taped the forearm and pressed on his ribs in 3 places until Ethan confirmed, with the specific restraint of a man not interested in making noise about pain, which one made the sharp intake of breath unavoidable. Cracked, probably. Not broken through. The paramedic wrapped it and told him he needed imaging, and Ethan said he'd get imaging, and they both understood that meant eventually. Through the glass wall of the server office, he could see Claire talking to 2 agents, the laptop open on the workstation behind her, her hands moving as she explained something. She looked exhausted in the way that came after sustained effort finally reached its end. Not collapsed, not relieved, but emptied. The specific deflation of a person whose entire system had been running at emergency capacity and had just been told it was allowed to slow down. He watched her for a moment, then he looked away, because staring felt like an intrusion on something private. Douglas Hale was arrested in the upper corridor of the facility at 1:47 a.m. by 2 agents from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit who had been coordinating with the Cyber Division for 11 days before tonight. The arrest was, by all accounts, quiet. Hale did not resist, did not speak, and did not look at anything in particular as they walked him out through the main entrance to a waiting vehicle. He had the manner of a man who was already working through the next set of calculations and had simply moved the current situation from the active column to the managed one. Ethan heard about this secondhand from Agent Reyes, who told him with the flat economy of someone delivering information rather than narrative. "He'll lawyer up within the hour," she said. "Good lawyers. This goes long. The documentation Claire sent out, we have it. All 6 recipients confirmed delivery within the first 30 minutes. She paused. The 2 journalists are going to be a problem in the sense that we can't control the publication timeline, which means we're going to be managing public disclosure while simultaneously managing the legal case, which is not the order anyone prefers. She said it without apparent frustration, just the steady acknowledgement of a complicated reality. But the core evidentiary package is solid. The financial architecture, the mirror program files, the operational logs. If half of what's in those documents holds up to forensic accounting review, we're looking at federal charges across at least 4 states and 3 agencies. And the 12 people on her list, Ethan said, the ones Mirror was used on. Reyes looked at him for a moment. That's the part of this that's going to take the longest, she said. Rebuilding their documented identities requires coordinating with every database that was corrupted, and some of those systems are state level, some are federal, some are private financial institutions. It's not a single fix. It's 100 separate processes, each with its own timeline and jurisdiction. She held his gaze. But it starts tonight. The moment I get authorization to begin the identity restoration requests, we start. That was part of the agreement with Miss Ashford for her cooperation. He nodded. He thought about Sandra Reeves in a shelter in Ohio and her kids who had been told she abandoned them, and he thought that 100 separate processes with their own timelines was an inadequate response to that reality, but was also the actual world, which rarely provided adequate responses on the schedule the damage demanded. "Where is she?" he asked. "Conference room upstairs. She asked for 20 minutes alone." Reyes considered him. She held it together in there remarkably well for someone who's been running without backup for a week. "She didn't have a choice," Ethan said. "Most people in her position would have broken 3 days in." She said it not as a compliment exactly, just an observation. Then she moved away down the corridor, already on her radio, already into the next layer of a night that had a long way to go before it finished. The conference room was on the facility's upper level, a rectangular space with a table and 8 chairs and a window that looked out over the north perimeter. The floodlights the federal teams had deployed outside turned everything beyond the glass into a flat, bright white, and Claire was sitting at the table with her back to the window and both hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that someone had brought her. She looked up when Ethan came in. "How's the rib?" she asked. "Taped." He sat down across from her. "How are you?" She thought about it for a moment, which he appreciated. She didn't reach for the reflexive fine that most people deployed when they didn't want to have the actual conversation. I'm not sure yet, she said. I think I've been running on a frequency that doesn't have a word for it, and now that it's stopped, I'm waiting to find out what's underneath it. That's normal. Is it? In my experience, yes. You run until you don't have to run anymore, and then everything you didn't have time to feel catches up to you in no particular order. He paused. It's not comfortable. Great. She looked down at the coffee. Something to look forward to. He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but close. You did everything right tonight. I did everything I planned, she said. It's not exactly the same thing. There were 3 points in that server room where it could have gone differently. She looked up at him. Specifically the 4 minutes where I was sitting at that terminal and you were on the other side of the glass doing things I couldn't see. You kept working. I didn't have another option. You could have stopped, pulled the drive, run. He said it not as criticism, just fact. A lot of people would have. She shook her head. Not after Sandra Reeves. Not after those 12 names. She set the coffee down. I don't say that to sound heroic. I just mean that once I knew specifically who was being hurt, the calculation became simple. The fear was still there. I was terrified the whole time. But it wasn't complicated anymore. He sat with that for a moment. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. The Dead Man Protocol, the one that sent everything out when the upload completed. He looked at her directly. When did you set that up? Day 2, she said. Before I reached out to anyone, before the storage unit. So when you recruited me, the documentation was already going out regardless of what happened in that server room, she confirmed. The upload was about destroying Mirror itself, not about the evidence. I had the evidence secured and scheduled for distribution from the moment I left San Francisco. He was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you tell me that? She met his eyes. Because I needed you to help me get to the terminal, and if you'd known the evidence was already going out, you might have decided the risk of the facility wasn't necessary. She said it directly, without dressing it up. I didn't lie to you about anything material, but I didn't give you the complete picture, and you should know that. He looked at her across the table. In another version of this conversation, he might have been angry about it. He understood the logic well enough not to be. She'd made a tactical decision about what information to deploy and when, the same way he made those decisions, and the outcome had been the right one. But he noted it. You needed to know who the person beside you actually was, and this was part of who she was. Okay, he said. She blinked. That's it? What do you want me to say? I don't know. I expected more reaction. You made a call, he said. It was the right call, and you knew it was the right call, which is why you made it. I'd have done the same thing. He paused. I would have told you afterward, too. Something in her expression shifted, a brief easing, like a muscle that had been held rigid finally releasing. I'm sorry, she said, for what it's worth. It's worth something, he said honestly, just not as much as you think. The next 4 hours were the specific administrative chaos of a federal operation at the intersection of multiple jurisdictions and agencies, each with its own lead agent and its own chain of accountability. Ethan gave his statement twice, once to Agent Reyes's team, once to a man from the DOJ who arrived at 3 a.m. in a suit that suggested he'd put it on in a hurry and had the focused, slightly overloaded quality of someone who'd been woken up with news that required immediate professional presence. The questions were detailed and repetitive, which was correct procedure and not particularly comfortable to sit through. He answered everything accurately and without embellishment, and without the strategic vagueness that people sometimes use to protect themselves in statements, because he decided somewhere in the car, on the drive to the Pinecrest Motor Inn 2 days ago, that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it completely, and a half-committed version of the truth was just a different kind of damage. He talked about Blackfall. All of it. The parameters they'd been given, the reality they'd found, the 4 operators who hadn't come out, Hale's response at the extraction point, the separation package and the NDA, and the 3 years of constructed quiet life in Hargrove Falls, Virginia. He said Douglas Hale's name clearly and specifically in connection with each relevant event and did not soften the accusations or hedge the conclusions he'd drawn. Understood that accusations required evidence to become charges and that his testimony alone was not sufficient, but he also understood that testimony created the scaffolding that evidence had somewhere to attach to, and so he built the scaffolding as completely and honestly as he could and left it for other people to do their jobs with. At one point, the DOJ attorney stopped him and said, "You're aware that your NDA is still a binding legal document." "I'm aware that an NDA signed under coercion in connection with conduct that constitutes federal crimes has limited enforceability," Ethan said. The attorney looked at him. "You have a legal background?" "I have a lot of quiet time to read," Ethan said, "and I've had 3 years to think about that specific document." He was done with his formal statement by 4:30 a.m. The sky outside had begun to do the thing it did in the last hour before actual dawn. Not lighter exactly, but differently dark. The specific shade of a night that has given most of itself away and is working through the remainder. Preston Vance, the Nexus board member whose connection to Hale had been the infiltration point for Mirror's access to Claire's infrastructure, was arrested at his home in McLean, Virginia at 3:15 a.m. by a separate team operating simultaneously with the Pennsylvania facility raid. Ethan learned this from Agent Reyes, who delivered the information with the same flat efficiency she'd applied to everything else, and then moved on before he could ask follow-up questions. By 5 a.m., the first of the 6 recipients had published. Not one of the journalists, they were still verifying, which was the correct professional response, but one of the federal agency recipients had apparently forwarded the package to a congressional oversight staffer who had not been included in the operational discretion protocols. And by 5:30 a.m., the documentation was on 3 major news sites simultaneously, attributed to anonymous federal sources, with enough specific detail that anyone who knew the relevant background would recognize it as genuine. Ethan read the first piece on a borrowed phone, sitting on a concrete step outside the facility's east entrance in the early dark, his back against the building and his taped ribs making themselves known every time he breathed too deeply. The piece was careful and specific and didn't sensationalize, which surprised him slightly, and then didn't, because the documentation itself was sensational enough that sensationalizing it would have felt redundant. Mirror was named. Vantris Solutions was named. The 12 confirmed cases were listed by initials and date, without identifying detail that would re-victimize the people involved, which told him that whoever had written the piece had made a specific editorial decision about that, and it was the right one. Hale's name appeared in the 14th paragraph, which was not where Ethan would have put it, but was probably a legal decision rather than an editorial one. He read the piece twice and then sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the sky, which was beginning, very gradually, to become something other than night. He thought about Mia. She'd have been awake for an hour by now. She was constitutionally incapable of sleeping past 6, a trait she'd had since infancy, and that Ethan had alternately cursed and accepted as simply part of her specific design. She'd be eating whatever Mrs. Yuen had put in front of her and asking questions about where he was. And Mrs. Yuen would be giving her the calibrated non-answers of a woman who had raised 3 children and understood that kids needed information rationed to what they could actually use. He needed to get home. Claire found him on the step at 5:45, carrying 2 cups of actual coffee from somewhere inside the facility. Apparently someone had located a working machine on the upper level, and this had improved the general morale of the federal agents considerably. She sat down beside him on the step and handed him one without ceremony. "They're going to need me in Washington," she said. "Probably by tomorrow afternoon. There's going to be a congressional briefing," they said. That was fast. "When it gets out at this scale, it has to move fast or it gets managed," she said. "The people who are good at managing this kind of thing are already awake and already on the phone. The only counter to that is speed and volume." He nodded. "You'll be okay doing that?" She looked at him sideways. Standing in front of a congressional panel and explaining technical architecture is considerably more comfortable than what I just did. She paused. "I've testified before. I know how rooms like that work. Different kind of pressure." "Yes, but it's a kind of pressure I'm better equipped for." She drank her coffee. "What about you?" "What about me? What happens to you now?" He thought about it. "I go home. I get imaging on the rib. I make pancakes." He paused. "Then I talk to a lawyer about the NDA and figure out whether my testimony tonight creates any immediate legal exposure." "It won't," Claire said. "Reyes told me they're treating your cooperation as integral to the operation's success. The U.S. Attorney's Office is not interested in pursuing the NDA breach given the circumstances." "You asked about me." "Of course I asked about you." She said it simply, without making anything of it. Just a fact about what she'd done and why. You walked into this for 12 people you didn't know, and a woman you'd met 6 hours earlier. The least I could do was make sure the people with authority understood the shape of what you did. He didn't say anything to that. There wasn't a clean response to it that didn't veer into something that felt like more than the step in the early dark and 2 cups of coffee warranted. After a while, she said, "Ethan." "Yeah." "What you said to Hale when he offered you the deal." She was looking straight ahead at the floodlit perimeter. "You had a real moment there. I saw it." "I had a real moment," he confirmed. "But you said no." "I said no." "Why?" She turned and looked at him. It wasn't a challenge. She genuinely wanted to understand the mechanism. Not the principle, the specific reason. In the moment, what made you say no? He thought about how to answer it honestly, which was different from how to answer it cleanly. "Because I thought about Sandra Reeves's kids," he said finally, "and I thought about my kid, and those two things pointed in the same direction. If I take the deal to protect Mia, I'm buying her safety with the safety of 2 kids in the Midwest who already lost their mother to this program. That's not a trade I can make and remain someone she'd want to be safe." He paused. "I know that sounds like it's trying to be a principle. It's not. It's just math." Claire looked at him for a long moment. "I think that's exactly what a principle is," she said quietly. "Just math that you've decided you won't deviate from." He didn't argue with that. The sky was genuinely lighter now. The east horizon had gone from dark blue to a deep gray-orange that would be full sunrise within 30 minutes. The floodlights around the perimeter were already starting to look unnecessary, their artificial brightness becoming redundant as the natural light built. Somewhere in Washington, a man who had run a classified program for a decade and had considered himself beyond the reach of accountability was sitting in a federal holding facility, and his lawyers were making phone calls. And the very extensive architecture of protection he had constructed around himself was being examined by people whose specific job was to find the seams and things like that. It would take time. It would be contested at every step. It would not be clean or fast or satisfying in the way that stories sometimes made these things seem. But it had started. And it had started because a woman had found the wrong data in an infrastructure audit and refused to pretend she hadn't, and a man had read 112 pages in a parking lot and made a decision he would have told you 2 days ago he was no longer capable of making. Ethan finished the coffee. He set the cup down on the step beside him and stretched carefully, feeling the rib register its formal complaint. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Okay?" "The leadership position, the security division." He looked at her. "You mentioned it to Reyes when you were talking about me. I heard you through the glass." Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, "I mentioned it as a possibility. I didn't make it a condition or a promise. I don't make promises I don't know I can keep." She paused. "Nexus is going to need to be rebuilt from the ground up. The board has to be reconstituted. Every contract with any connection to the Vantris chain needs to be reviewed and renegotiated. The infrastructure we built that was being used as Mirror's host framework needs to be audited, cleaned, and recertified." She said it with the focused attention of someone who was already, at 6 a.m. after the worst week of her life, starting to think about what came next and how to build it right. "I need people around me who understand both the technical architecture and the accountability failure that allowed this to happen. People who don't have a professional incentive to minimize what went wrong." She looked at him. "I'm not asking you tonight. You've got a rib to image and a daughter who wants pancakes. I'm just saying it's a real thing, not a courtesy." He looked at her. "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking." A federal vehicle pulled up on the East Access Road, and an agent Ethan didn't recognize stepped out and caught Claire's attention with a wave that indicated something needed her. She stood, picked up her coffee cup, and then paused. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Go home." She said it simply, without sentiment, but also without the kind of removal that made simple things sound cold. "Go home and make the pancakes." He watched her walk toward the vehicle. She moved with the same quality she'd had at the motel door, the same structural certainty, but something in it was different from 6 hours ago. Lighter, maybe. Or just differently weighted. The thing she'd been carrying for 6 days had not been put down exactly, but it had been shared out to enough people that her specific portion of it was no longer the whole. He got to his feet carefully, favoring the rib, and walked to where the Civic was parked on the service road under the trees. The drive home took an hour and 40 minutes. The sun came up somewhere in West Virginia, angling through the passenger window and laying itself across the empty seat. He drove with the radio off because he didn't want noise, just the sound of the road and the engine and the gradual brightening of the world outside the glass. He thought about what Claire had said, about the math that becomes a principle, about the specific calculation that points the same direction every time you run it regardless of the cost. He thought she might be right about that. He didn't think she was entirely right about it being simple. Some calculations were correct and devastating at the same time, and the fact that you ran them honestly didn't make the cost feel smaller. He thought about Hale's face in the moment when the server lights started going dark. Not broken, not destroyed, just recalculating. There was something about that, some specific quality of a man who had spent 40 years treating every human situation as a variable to be managed, that he found more troubling than overt malice. Malice was at least something you could point to and name. What Hale had was worse. The complete self-contained certainty that his particular math was the only math that mattered, and that everyone else's numbers were simply inputs into his own. He crossed the Virginia state line at 7:10 a.m. and felt something shift in him. Not relief, not quite, but the particular quality of returning to a geography your body recognizes as the place where the people you would do anything for are. He parked in front of the apartment building at 7:43. He sat in the car for a moment and did an inventory of what he looked like. Taped ribs, bandaged forearm, 48 hours of stubble becoming something else, dark circles, a jacket with a scrape on one sleeve. He looked like a man who had been doing things that took something out of him. He looked, in other words, like a dad who had been somewhere and was back now, and that was probably good enough. Mrs. Ewan opened the apartment door before he knocked. She looked at him with the particular comprehensive assessment of a woman who had seen a great deal of human difficulty in 63 years and had learned to read it in people's posture. "Pancakes," she said. "Yeah," he said, "pancakes." She stepped aside and he walked in, and Mia came out of the kitchen at a dead run the way she did when she'd heard a door and confirmed it was his, and he crouched down despite the rib's formal objection and caught her, and she hit him with the full momentum of a 7-year-old who had been containing concern all morning without having a word for it. "You were gone all night," she said into his shoulder. "I know. I'm sorry." Mrs. Yuen said it was a work thing. It was. She pulled back and looked at his face with the same comprehensive assessment Mrs. Yuen had applied, which he found both unsettling and correct. "You look bad," she said. "Thanks. Did something happen to your arm?" "I scraped it." She examined the bandage with the focused attention of someone who wanted to assess damage, and was also buying time to decide how she felt about the whole situation. Then she looked up at him. "Can we still have pancakes?" "That," he said, "is absolutely happening." She wriggled out of his arms and went back toward the kitchen with the elastic recovery of a child whose primary emotional need had been met and who was now ready to move on to the next item on the agenda. He straightened up, and Mrs. Ewan, who had watched all of this from the doorway, met his eyes briefly and said nothing, which was exactly the right amount. He followed his daughter into the kitchen, and outside the window the morning was fully arrived, sunlight flat and ordinary across the rooftops of Hargrove Falls. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, a building full of dead servers was being documented by people with evidence bags. And somewhere in Washington, a man in a suit was already constructing the first of what would be many careful legal arguments. And somewhere in Ohio, a woman named Sandra Reeves was going to wake up this morning and not yet know that the first steps toward restoring the documented proof of her own existence had begun last night in a server room. The world was what it was. It moved at the speed it moved and delivered its corrections on the schedule it chose, and none of that was fair and very little of it was satisfying. And Ethan Mercer stood at his kitchen counter with a bowl and a box of pancake mix and listened to his daughter explain, in significant detail, which cartoon she wanted to watch while they ate, and held both of those realities in the same hands at the same time. Because that was what you did when you were a person living in the actual world rather than any of its cleaner alternatives. The pancakes were slightly burnt on one side because he'd misjudged the heat on the burner, which hadn't been calibrated correctly for 3 months, and which he'd been meaning to get looked at. Mia ate them anyway, without comment, which was either a sign of genuine hunger or the particular generosity of a 7-year-old who understood that her father was having some kind of mourning and had decided not to add to it. He suspected both. She'd always been perceptive in the specific way of children who had grown up with only one parent to read. They learned to track that one person with the focused attention that other kids distributed across two, and they got very good at it. He ate standing at the counter because sitting made the rib worse, and he drank 2 cups of coffee and watched her work through the pancakes methodically, while explaining the plot of a cartoon that appeared to involve a raccoon with engineering skills and some kind of civic dispute. He followed about 40% of it. The 40% was enough. Mrs. Yuen left at 9, refusing the cash he offered with the particular firmness of someone who had already decided what the situation required and didn't need to renegotiate it at the door. He thanked her in the way you thank someone when the word isn't adequate but is the only tool available. At 10, he took Mia to the urgent care clinic 2 miles from the apartment. He told the intake nurse he'd taken a fall. She looked at the pattern of bruising visible above the bandage on his forearm and the way he was holding his left side and wrote down fall on the intake form without any particular expression, which he appreciated. The imaging confirmed what the paramedic had suspected. 1 cracked rib, nothing displaced, nothing requiring surgery, rest and time, and not doing anything like what he'd done to crack it in the first place for at least 6 weeks. "What did you fall on?" the radiologist asked, looking at the film. "Several things," Ethan said. Mia, sitting in the plastic chair by the examination table with his phone playing the raccoon cartoon, looked up at that and then looked back at the phone. She was storing it. She'd ask about it later when it was just the two of them and she'd had time to decide what she actually wanted to know. The story broke wide at noon. He knew because his phone, his regular phone, not the burner, started receiving messages from people he hadn't heard from in months or years. A former teammate who had separated 2 years after Ethan, now working private security in Houston. A woman who had been in his buds class and who he hadn't spoken to since the debrief that had functionally ended his career. A cousin in Savannah who followed the news obsessively and who sent him a link with the message, "Isn't this the thing you were involved in way back?" which told him either that his name had appeared somewhere in the coverage or that his cousin was very good at inference. His name had appeared. Not prominently. He was described in the initial pieces as a former special operations operator whose testimony corroborated Ms. Ashford's findings. But it was there, and once it was there, it was findable, and people who knew him found it. He didn't respond to any of the messages that afternoon. He sat on the couch with Mia, who had fallen asleep against his good side sometime around 1 p.m. with the raccoon cartoon still going, and he watched the news on his laptop with the volume low and let the story unfold in the particular way that stories unfolded when they were large enough to move faster than anyone's ability to manage them. By 3 p.m., 2 congressional representatives had issued statements. By 5 p.m., Hale's attorney had appeared on a news segment to describe the arrests as politically motivated and procedurally irregular, which was the first move in the predictable sequence of a legal defense that would be expensive and prolonged. By 7 p.m., Sandra Reeves had been located by a journalist at the shelter in Columbus, Ohio, and had given a brief statement from the shelter's common room that was 12 sentences long and included the information that she hadn't been able to speak to her children in 14 months. Ethan read that piece twice. He read it the way you read something that you know you're going to carry for a long time. Not for information, because he already had it, but for the specific weight of it, because some things needed to be felt in full rather than processed at a distance. He made dinner. He put Mia to bed at her regular time, sat on the edge of her bed in the dark while she fell asleep, and then went back to the couch and sat there for a while in the quiet of the apartment and thought about the shape of things. The apartment was the same as it had been 48 hours ago. Same dent in the passenger door of the Civic outside. Same raccoon cartoon saved in the watch history. Same half-finished grocery list on the kitchen counter. The world inside this space had not shifted in any visible way, and yet something about the coordinates of his life had moved, and he was still in the early process of figuring out how much and in which direction. He'd lived 3 years as an invisible man. It had been a deliberate choice, and it had been the right choice for what it was. But invisibility had its own costs that he hadn't fully understood when he'd chosen it. You couldn't disappear completely. The past didn't stay where you put it. The things you were capable of didn't stop being part of you just because you'd stopped using them. And the decisions you'd walked away from didn't stop existing in the world just because you were no longer looking at them. He'd known Blackfall was wrong. He'd filed the report. And then he'd signed the paper and taken Mia and left. And for 3 years, he'd called that the only rational choice and lived inside that description of it and refused to examine it too closely. It had kept him functioning. It had kept Mia stable and fed, and in a good school district with a Fox backpack. Those were not nothing. Those were real. But Sandra Reeves was in a shelter in Ohio, and 12 people had had their documented lives stripped away, and Hale had kept running Mirror for 3 years after Ethan had left, partly because Ethan had left. He didn't know how to hold that exactly. He'd been trying to figure it out for 2 days and hadn't arrived at anything clean. He suspected he wasn't going to, suspected that some things didn't resolve into clean lessons, that they just became part of the sediment of what you carried and what you were, and that the most honest response to them was not absolution or self-punishment, but the slower, harder work of deciding what you were going to do going forward and then actually doing it. He called Claire at 9 p.m. She was in Washington, had been since early afternoon, and she answered on the second ring sounding like someone running on the last quarter tank of something that had been full 3 days ago. "How's the rib?" she asked. "Cracked, not broken through." "That's better than it could be." "That's what the radiologist said." He paused. "How was the briefing?" "Long, technical. 3 of the members of the panel didn't understand what an infrastructure host framework was, and I had to explain it 4 times in progressively simpler language." She exhaled. The 4th explanation involved an analogy about apartment buildings and invisible tenants, which finally worked. "That's a good analogy. I came up with it somewhere around hour 3. Necessity." A pause. "How's your daughter?" "Fine, good. She ate the burnt pancakes without saying anything, which tells you what you need to know about her character." He heard something that wasn't quite a laugh, but was close to one. "She sounds like a good kid." "She's a very good kid," he said. "She didn't ask any questions today about last night. She's waiting until she's ready, which is also her character." "Smart." "Terrifyingly so." He shifted his position on the couch and let the rib make its complaint and then settle. "I wanted to call and tell you that Sandra Reeves gave a statement. Did you see it?" A moment of quiet on the other end. "I saw it. She said she hadn't talked to her kids in 14 months. "I know." Claire's voice was careful, like someone picking through something fragile. "The identity restoration request for her case specifically went into the system this afternoon," Reyes told me. "The financial records should start coming back within the week. Her bank account is actually still intact. The access was just blocked at the authentication layer. Her professional credentials are more complicated, but there's a federal coordination order that's supposed to move those through on an expedited timeline." "How expedited?" "Weeks, not months. For her case." A pause. "Some of the others are more complicated. One of them was a state employee, and the state database corruption requires a different remediation process than the federal cases. It's going to take longer." "But it's moving." "It's moving," she confirmed. "It's not fast enough." "It's never going to be fast enough for people who've been living with this for months. But it's real, and it started, and it's not going to stop." He sat with that for a moment. It was the same thing Reyes had said in the facility corridor, and it was true, and it was still insufficient, and those 2 things could coexist, and he was learning to let them. "Claire." "Yeah." "The position you mentioned, the security division." A brief silence, careful. "I meant it as a real offer. I also meant it when I said I wasn't asking tonight." "I know you did." He looked at the kitchen counter, the grocery list, the ordinary geometry of the life he'd been living. "I'm not saying yes yet. I want to be clear about that. There are things I need to figure out first. Mia's school, logistics, what it actually looks like day to day, whether it's the right thing for her and not just the thing that makes sense on paper." "That's fair." "But I'm not saying no either," he said. "I'm saying I'm thinking about it in a way that's different from how I was thinking about it yesterday." "What changed?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "I spent 3 years being invisible," he said. "I thought that was the responsible choice. And maybe it was, for a while. But invisible has a cost I didn't fully account for, and I think I've been paying it in ways I didn't notice because I was focused on what it was protecting." He paused. "What you're building, if it's actually about accountability instead of secrecy, that's something I understand how to contribute to. Not because I want to be operational again, but because I know what happens when the accountability systems fail, and I know it from the inside, and that's worth something if it's pointed in the right direction." Claire was quiet for a moment on the other end. "It's pointed in the right direction," she said. "I can't promise it'll be perfect, I can't promise I'll get everything right. I've already proven that I can have a conspiracy running in my own infrastructure for 2 years without catching it, which is a fairly significant failure of exactly the kind of oversight I'm now claiming to represent. I know. That doesn't bother you? It makes me trust you more, he said. People who know what they got wrong are more useful than people who think they got everything right. He paused. Take the time you need in Washington. We'll talk when you're back. 3 months passed in the way that months passed when they contained large events, faster in memory than they were in living. The days themselves sometimes long and grinding, and the accumulated span of them somehow gone before you'd finished processing the middle section. The federal case against Douglas Hale moved through the preliminary phases with the grinding formality of major prosecutions, which meant it moved slowly and with the kind of procedural complexity that required teams of lawyers on both sides, and produced a great volume of documents that the news covered in pieces and the public mostly couldn't follow. The charges were extensive: fraud, conspiracy, obstruction, and a set of charges under statutes that covered illegal experimentation on citizens that had rarely been used in the modern era and that required the prosecutors to build evidentiary foundations from first principles. Hale's legal team was exactly as formidable as Reyes had predicted. They filed motions at a volume that appeared designed more to delay and exhaust than to win any individual argument, and they were partially successful in that strategy. The trial date was set for 14 months out, which was better than it could have been and worse than it should have been, which was the accurate description of most things in the legal system when one party had essentially unlimited resources. Preston Vance took a plea at 6 weeks, which was faster than anyone had expected, and which suggested that whatever he'd been promised for cooperation was considered worth the alternative. His cooperation opened 3 additional investigative threads that the original documentation hadn't covered, which added complexity to the case and was, overall, a net positive development, even though it extended the timeline further. 4 of the 12 mirror victims had their identities fully restored within the first 2 months. 3 more were in advanced stages of the restoration process by the end of the 3rd month. The remaining 5 cases were complicated by state-level database issues or private financial system entanglements that required court orders to resolve, and those cases moved at the pace of court orders, which was its own specific kind of slow. Sandra Reeves spoke to her children for the first time in 15 months on a Tuesday evening in October, over a video call arranged by the federal case coordinator. Ethan learned about it from a brief note in a court filing update that Reyes sent him. Not the emotional content of the call, just the logistical fact of it, confirmed as a milestone in the identity restoration case. He read the single sentence that described it and sat with it for a while. He thought about what that call must have felt like from both ends. The mother trying to explain something that had no explanation a child should ever have to receive. The kids on the other side of the screen looking at a face they'd been told had chosen to leave them. He thought about the specific damage that would take years to repair and might never repair completely, and he thought about how that damage traced directly back to a man who had considered it an acceptable operational variance. He went and checked on Mia, who was doing homework at the kitchen table with the focused expression she wore when she was slightly confused but not yet ready to ask for help. He sat down across from her and waited. "Dad." "Yeah." "What's 42 divided by 6? 7. She wrote it down. "How do you just know that?" "Practice," he said. "You know it too. You just don't know you know it yet." She looked at him skeptically. Then she looked back at the worksheet. He stayed at the table and they worked through the rest of it together, her doing the actual thinking and him asking the questions that led her to the answer rather than providing it, which was slower and occasionally frustrating for both of them, but which produced a different quality of understanding than just being told. It occurred to him, sitting there at the kitchen table under the overhead light, that this was the thing he'd actually been protecting for 3 years. Not just her safety in a physical sense, not just the logistical continuity of her life. This specific quality of ordinary time, homework at the kitchen table, a question about division, the slow building of understanding in a person who was still in the early stages of figuring out what she was capable of. The invisibility had been for this, and the end of the invisibility had also been for this, in a different way, so that the world she was growing up into was a slightly less compromised version of itself than it would have been if he'd looked at the laptop in the Riverside storage parking lot and driven home. He didn't think those two things canceled each other out. I thought they were both real and both mattered, and that learning to hold them both without needing them to resolve into a single clean truth was part of what it meant to be an adult. Making decisions in a complicated world. He started at Nexus in November. The title was Director of Accountability and Security Operations, which was a title Claire had constructed carefully to convey both the function and the philosophy, and which he had told her was the kind of title that sounded like it was trying too hard, and which she had told him was exactly the kind of title that the board needed to see in order to understand that the division was not just a rebranding of the security team that had existed before. He'd said fine, and meant it, and had moved on to the actual work, which was more interesting than the title. The division's mandate was straightforward in description and complicated in execution. Audit every contract, every data access agreement, and every infrastructure deployment that Nexus was party to, and build a framework for ongoing accountability that didn't rely on any single person's ethical standards, because single persons changed, retired, got pressured, made mistakes, but on structural systems that made concealment actively difficult regardless of who was in which role. He was not a tech person. He knew enough to follow the conversations and to understand the principles, and he'd spent the 3 months between the facility and his start date reading everything relevant he could get his hands on, but he would never be the person in the room who understood the deepest layer of the architecture. He hired those people. He understood what they were protecting and why, and he understood what motivated people to compromise protection systems. And he understood the specific pathways by which institutional trust eroded, slowly, through small accommodations and convenient blindnesses, until the thing that was supposed to be protecting people was being used to harm them. Understood that last part from the inside, which turned out to be useful in exactly the way he'd thought it might. Claire had rebuilt the Nexus board from scratch over the same 3 months, replacing every member with any connection to the Vantris supply chain and bringing in 3 independent directors with backgrounds in ethics oversight rather than finance, which was unusual enough in the tech sector that several industry publications wrote about it with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. She gave interviews that were more honest about Nexus's failures than most CEOs were comfortable being publicly, and she did it without the performative self-flagellation that sometimes substituted for actual accountability. She stated what had gone wrong, what had allowed it to go wrong, and what specific structural changes were being made to make the same failure harder the next time. She didn't promise it would be impossible. She said harder, and she meant it. He watched her do this from the periphery of several of those interviews, and thought that she was genuinely good at the part of the job that required telling people difficult true things without losing them. A skill that was rarer than it should have been and that couldn't be trained exactly, only developed through repeated exposure to the consequence of not doing it. He told her that once, after a particularly long board meeting that had covered 3 hours of material that should have taken 90 minutes. She looked at him sideways. Was that a compliment? It was an observation. Coming from you, I'm taking it as a compliment. Fair enough. They had developed, over the months since the facility, the particular working relationship of 2 people who had been through something extreme together and had come out the other side with a clear, unsentimental understanding of each other's limitations and capabilities. It wasn't the easy warmth of friendship that had developed gradually over time. It was something more immediate and more specific, the kind of trust that got built in the dark, under pressure, when there was no room for performance, and that survived into ordinary conditions because it had been tested in conditions that were anything but. They argued regularly about methodology. He came from a background where the objective was clear and the question was execution. She came from a background where the objective itself was often the thing under negotiation. These orientations created friction in planning meetings that was usually productive and occasionally not, and they'd both learned to tell the difference and to push through the unproductive friction rather than accommodate it. She'd asked him once, in a meeting that had gone sideways on the question of how much access the accountability division should have to executive communications, whether he trusted her judgment. He'd said, "I trust your intentions. Your judgment, I check." She'd been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, "That's the right answer, actually." "I know," he'd said. The trial date for Hale was still 11 months out. When December came and the year turned and Mia started second grade with a teacher she liked and a classroom friend named Olivia who shared her architectural interest in elaborate block structures and her competitive investment in handball, which suggested the playground dispute from the prior year had resolved into something more productive. Ethan drove her to school on the mornings he was in Hargrove Falls, which was most mornings. He'd negotiated a structure that kept him local 4 days a week and in the Nexus offices in D.C. one day, with additional travel as needed but minimized as a default. Because Mia's schedule was not a variable he was willing to treat as flexible. This had been a condition of the job, stated clearly before he signed anything, and Claire had agreed to it without negotiation, which told him something important about her priorities that had informed every subsequent working interaction. On a Tuesday morning in January, he was parked in the school pickup line, drop-off, technically, the reverse of the process, with Mia in the passenger seat running through the contents of her backpack to confirm she had everything, when she said, without looking up from the backpack, "Dad." "Yeah." Tyler Reeves said his mom came back. He went still for a moment. Tyler Reeves was a third grader at Mia's school. He'd learned about Tyler Reeves approximately 2 months ago, when Mia had mentioned him in the context of a school fundraiser, and he had done a quiet check and confirmed what the name suggested: Sandra Reeves's son, placed with extended family in Hargrove Falls while his mother's situation was being resolved. He had not told Mia any of that. He hadn't known she'd made the connection, or that there was a connection to make at the child's level. "He told you that?" Ethan said. "At lunch yesterday." She found what she was looking for in the backpack and zipped it shut. He was really happy. He said she's staying with their aunt right now, but she's getting her own place soon. She looked up at him. "Is that the lady from the news? That you helped?" He thought about how to answer that. "One of them," he said. "I helped a few people." She nodded, taking that in with the particular gravity she applied to information she'd been waiting to receive. "Is that what you were doing that night, when you were gone?" "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't want you to worry about something that might not work out," he said, "and because some of it was complicated and you were 7. I'm still 7. You're almost 8. She considered this distinction with the judiciousness it deserved. "Were you scared?" He thought about it. "Yes." "But you did it anyway." "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her backpack and opened the car door, and then she stopped and looked back at him in the way she did when she'd decided something. "Tyler Reeves was really happy," she said again. "Like, really happy." She said it with the specific emphasis of someone who wanted to make sure he understood the scale of a thing. "I thought you should know." She got out and closed the door and walked toward the school entrance with her laces tied correctly for once. And he watched her go in the way he always did, all the way to the door, until she was inside, the same way he'd been watching her all the way to every door she'd walked through since she was 4 days old, and the world had rearranged itself into something he hadn't planned for and couldn't imagine having missed. He stayed parked for a moment after she disappeared inside. He thought about what she'd said. Really happy, like really happy. And about what it cost to produce that quality of happiness in a kid who had spent over a year being told his mother had left him. He thought about the specific chain of events that connected Sandra Reeves's son eating lunch with his daughter in Hargrove Falls, Virginia, to a woman in a motel room with a broken shoe and a laptop full of evidence and 6 days of running behind her. He thought about how that chain included his own 3 years of invisibility and his own moment of decision in a parking lot and the specific quality of a math problem that pointed the same direction every time you ran it, honestly. None of it was clean. None of it had been resolved into a lesson that you could state simply and carry cleanly. He was still figuring out what he should have done differently in the years before the storage unit, and he suspected he would be figuring that out for a long time, and that the figuring out was part of the actual living rather than something that preceded it. But a kid named Tyler Reeves had been really happy at lunch, and his daughter had thought he should know. He pulled out of the drop-off line and into the ordinary morning traffic of Hargrove Falls, heading toward the highway and the city, and a day of work that was genuinely difficult and genuinely necessary and not invisible at all. The following spring, on an afternoon when the DC sky had finally decided to behave like something other than a ceiling, Ethan was standing at the window of the Nexus Accountability Division's office on the 14th floor, looking at the city below with the particular unfocused attention of someone thinking about something unrelated to what they're looking at, when Claire came in without knocking, which was her consistent practice, and which he'd stopped noting as unusual 3 months in. She had a folder in one hand and the expression she wore when she was carrying information she'd already decided how to present. "The first Mirror civil case filed," she said. "Sandra Reeves's attorney. They're naming Hale personally, Vantris Solutions as an entity, and 3 of the former Nexus board members who can be tied to the oversight failure." "When did it file?" "This morning." She sat down across from his desk. "Her attorney is good. The case is solid. It's going to take years, but it's solid." "Good." She opened the folder and slid a page across the desk. It was a summary of the remaining Mirror identity restoration cases. He'd been following their progress since November, getting updates from the federal case coordinator when they were available. He looked at the summary. 7 of 12 fully restored, 4 in process. 1 still in early stages due to a state database complication that had required a separate court action to resolve. "The last one," he said. "Waiting on a federal judge to sign the remediation order," Claire said. "Reyes says 2 weeks, maybe 3. He nodded. He set the page down on the desk and looked at it for a moment. 7 of 12. 11 of 12 in process. 1 more judge's signature away from 12 of 12. Having a path back to their own documented existence. It wasn't finished. It wouldn't be finished for a long time. Hale's trial was still 8 months out, and would last weeks when it came. And the civil cases would follow the criminal case in the way that legal things followed each other in sequence rather than parallel. And the full accounting of what Mirror had done and who had allowed it to happen would take years to assemble and even longer to adjudicate. The people who had been erased would spend years rebuilding what had been taken from them even after their documentation was restored, because documentation was just the beginning of the work of reconstituting a life that had been systematically unmade. He knew all of that. He held it alongside the other things he knew, which was that 7 people were already living in the world again as documented, legally recognized versions of themselves, and that a kid named Tyler Reeves had been really happy at lunch, and that his daughter was almost 8 years old and had recently developed a conviction that the crab tiger she'd drawn in 1st grade had actually been misunderstood rather than wrong. "What are you thinking?" Claire asked. He looked up. She was watching him with the particular attention she gave to people when she thought they were processing something worth waiting for. "I'm thinking that it's enough," he said. "Not everything. Not finished. Not what it should have been from the start. But enough to keep going." She nodded slowly. "That's a hard thing to stay with." "Yes," he agreed. "It is." "You're good at it, though." He looked at her. "I'm getting better at it." She accepted that with a slight nod, the way she accepted most things that were accurate, not by making much of them, just by registering them and moving on. She took the folder back and stood. "There's a board meeting at 4. 2 of the new independent directors want to discuss the audit framework revision. I'll be there." She moved toward the door and then stopped, which was not her usual practice. She was typically direct about exits and re-entries and didn't hover. He waited. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I know I said I don't make promises I can't keep." She looked at him steadily. "But I want to say this anyway, and you can hold me to it." She paused. "Whatever this becomes, the division, the company, the work, I will not stop looking at it clearly. I won't let it become comfortable enough that I stop seeing what it actually is and what it could become if we stop paying attention." She said it without ceremony, just the flat, specific quality of someone stating a commitment they intended to mean. "That's what I'm promising." He looked at her for a moment. "Okay," he said. "That's it?" "That's it," he said. "It's a good promise. Hold it." She left. He turned back to the window and the city below, which was doing its ordinary Tuesday afternoon business in the spring light, traffic and pedestrians, and the flat glitter of the Potomac visible in the distance between buildings. And he stood there for a while and let himself simply be present in it. He thought about what it meant to do the right thing in a world that rarely arranged itself to make the right thing easy or clean or clearly defined in advance. I thought about the specific mechanism of it. Not heroism, nothing like that, just the repeated daily choice to look at what was actually in front of you and respond to it honestly, rather than to the more comfortable version of it you could construct if you looked sideways. That was the whole of it. That was the thing he'd failed at for 3 years and had managed imperfectly when it mattered most. He didn't know if he'd get it right the next time. He expected he would get some of it wrong. He intended to keep looking anyway. His phone buzzed. A text from the number he'd saved as M, because Mia had gotten her own school communication tablet and had immediately used it to send him a message that consisted entirely of the word "hi," followed by 6 fox emojis. He typed back, "Hi, how's your day?" The response came in 30 seconds. "Good. Olivia said my tiger looks like a tiger now." He read that twice. He put the phone in his pocket. He looked at the city one more moment, the spring afternoon light moving across it in the way light moved when it had nowhere particular to be. Then he went to the board meeting.